Hello everyone, I'm back with another deep dive into one of America's most haunting cold cases. And I need to warn you right now. This case is different. This isn't just about solving a murder. This is about a mystery that haunted an entire city for 65 years. A mystery about a little boy who had no name, no family, no one to claim him. Until 2022, when everything changed. Before we begin, if you're interested in detailed investigations into cold cases that deserve answers, hit that subscribe button. This channel is brand new, and we're building a community dedicated to keeping these stories alive, to making sure these victims are never forgotten. Every subscription helps us continue this work. And if this case moves you the way it moved me, leave a like so more people can discover it. February 25, 1957. Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. A young man is checking his muskrat traps in a wooded area of Fox Chase, a neighborhood in the northeast section of the city. It's cold. The kind of Philadelphia winter cold that seeps into your bones. He's not expecting to find anything unusual. Just another routine check of his trapline. Then he sees it. A large JCPenney bassinet box lying in the underbrush, about 15 feet from the road. At first, he doesn't think much of it. People dump trash in these woods all the time. But something makes him look closer. Something about the way the box is positioned. The way it's been carefully placed, not just thrown away. He opens the box. Inside is the naked body of a small boy, wrapped in a plaid blanket. The child's body has been folded, placed carefully inside the cardboard container. His eyes are partially open. His hair has been recently cut, crudely, with chunks missing. His body shows signs of severe abuse. The young man runs. He doesn't report what he's seen. He's checking his traps illegally, and he's terrified of getting in trouble. It will be 2 more days before someone else finds the box. 2 more days before the world learns about the boy who had no name. This is the story of America's unknown child. A case so disturbing, so mysterious, that it would consume investigators for generations. A case where an entire city adopted a murdered boy as their own, visiting his grave, bringing him toys, refusing to let him be forgotten. For 65 years, he was just the boy in the box. A child so brutalized that even in death, no one came forward to claim him. No missing persons report matched his description. No parent or relative ever stepped forward. It was as if he had never existed at all. But he did exist. He lived. He suffered. And in 2022, he finally got his name back. His name was Joseph Augustus Zarelli. He was 4 years old when someone murdered him and threw him away like garbage. And this is his complete story. Every detail of the investigation. Every theory. Every dead end. Every breakthrough. And finally, after 65 years, the truth about who he was. This is one of the longest-running cold cases in American history. And what you're about to hear will stay with you long after this video ends. Welcome to another investigation. Tonight, we're going back to 1957, to a Philadelphia that was about to confront one of its darkest secrets. We begin. February 27, 1957. 2 days after that young man found the box but said nothing. A college student named Frank Guthrum is driving down Susquehanna Road in Fox Chase, running an errand for his father. It's mid-afternoon, the winter sun already starting to fade. Something catches his eye in the woods, about 10 feet from the road. A cardboard box in the underbrush. And next to it, what looks like a small body. Frank stops his car immediately. His heart is pounding as he approaches. He's praying he's wrong, that it's just a doll, just trash, anything but what it looks like. But he's not wrong. Inside the large JCPenney bassinet box, the kind used to transport baby bassinets from the store, is the naked body of a small boy. The child is lying on his side, his body folded to fit inside the box. A cheap plaid blanket is wrapped around him, the kind you might find at any department store for a few dollars. Frank doesn't touch anything. He runs back to his car and drives immediately to the nearest phone. Within 20 minutes, Philadelphia police are on the scene. What they find will haunt them for the rest of their lives. The boy appears to be between 4 and 6 years old, though determining exact age will prove difficult. He's small for his age, malnourished. His body weighs only 30 pounds. He's white, with brown hair that's been cut recently and very badly. There are chunks missing, uneven sections, as if someone had hacked at his hair with dull scissors in a hurry. His body is covered in bruises, old and new. Some are fading, yellow and green. Others are fresh, dark purple and blue. The medical examiner will later count 17 separate areas of bruising on this small body. But it's his face that investigators will never forget. His eyes are partially open, as if he died looking at something or someone. His expression is neutral, almost peaceful, which seems impossible given what was done to him. One officer will later say it looked like the boy had simply accepted his fate, had stopped fighting long before death came. The boy's hands are wrinkled, pruned, as if he'd been in water for an extended period before death. His fingernails are clean, recently trimmed. Someone had bathed him, groomed him, prepared him. This wasn't a body that had been abandoned immediately after death. Someone had taken time with him. Detective Samuel Weinstein is one of the first on the scene. He's a 20-year veteran of the Philadelphia Police Department, a man who's seen everything the city can throw at him. Murders, suicides, accidents. He thought nothing could shock him anymore. He was wrong. "I've got kids of my own," Weinstein will later tell reporters. "Looking at that boy in that box, I made a promise right there. I promised him I'd find out who he was. I'd find out who did this to him. I thought it would take a few days, maybe a week. How could a child go missing and nobody report it?" The scene is carefully processed. The box is a JCPenney bassinet container, model number unknown but traceable. The blanket is cheap, mass-produced, available at any department store in the Philadelphia area. There are no identifying marks on either item, no receipts, no tags, nothing that might lead back to a purchaser. The boy's body is carefully removed from the box and transported to the morgue. The medical examiner, Dr. Joseph Spellman, begins his examination that same evening. What he finds tells a story of systematic abuse and ultimately, murder. The boy had been severely malnourished for an extended period. His stomach was empty at the time of death. He hadn't eaten for at least a day, possibly longer. His body showed signs of chronic malnutrition, suggesting weeks or months of inadequate food. The cause of death was determined to be blows to the head. The boy had sustained multiple impacts to his skull, causing fatal injuries. He had also been struck repeatedly about the body. Some of the bruises were weeks old. Some were days old. Some were inflicted at or near the time of death. There was something else. Something that made the case even more disturbing. The boy's hair had been cut very recently, within hours of death. The cuts were crude, uneven, done hastily. Clumps of hair were found in the box with the body. Someone had cut this child's hair after killing him, or very shortly before. Why? That question would haunt investigators for decades. Why cut a dead child's hair? Was it to disguise his appearance? To remove evidence? Or was it something else, something darker, some kind of ritual or compulsion? The body also showed signs of surgical scars, old injuries that had healed. Someone had taken this boy to a doctor at some point, for some kind of medical procedure. This meant there should be medical records somewhere. Records that could identify him. But when police checked every hospital, every clinic, every doctor's office in Philadelphia and the surrounding counties, they found nothing. No record of any child matching his description. No reports of any surgical procedures on a boy his age with his characteristics. It was as if Joseph had been invisible even when he was alive. Detectives canvassed the area where the body was found. Fox Chase was a working-class neighborhood, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business. Surely someone had seen something. A car. A person. Something. They found nothing. No witnesses. No reports of suspicious activity. The area where the body was found was remote enough that someone could have parked on Susquehanna Road, carried the box 15 feet into the woods, and been gone in less than 5 minutes. The police did find one thing that seemed significant. About 100 yards from where the body was found, they discovered a man's blue corduroy cap. It was lying in the underbrush, partially hidden. Could it have belonged to the killer? Or was it just random trash, unconnected to the case? They also found a small white handkerchief near the body. It had no identifying marks, no initials, nothing that could trace it back to anyone. Just another mass-produced item that could have been purchased anywhere. But investigators held on to these items anyway. The cap. The handkerchief. The blanket. The box. Each piece carefully catalogued, preserved, stored away. Just in case. The Philadelphia Police Department made a decision that would define this case for decades. They were going to find out who this boy was, no matter what it took. They were going to give him his name back. They started with missing persons reports. Every unsolved missing child case in Pennsylvania was reviewed. Then they expanded to New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, New York. Then the entire East Coast. Then the entire country. Over 400 missing children cases were examined in detail. Each one was compared against the boy's physical description, his estimated age, his dental records, his scars, his fingerprints. Not a single match. How was that possible? How could a child die and nobody report him missing? Where were his parents? His family? Even if he'd been an orphan, even if he'd been in foster care, someone should have noticed he was gone. The police released the boy's fingerprints to every agency in the country. Nothing. They circulated his description to every police department, every social services agency, every hospital. Nothing. It was as if Joseph Augustus Zarelli had never existed in any official capacity. As if he'd been kept hidden from the world his entire short life. Detective Weinstein couldn't let it go. This case consumed him. He worked it on his own time, on his days off, during his vacation. His wife would later say the case changed him, made him quieter, more distant. He couldn't stop thinking about that little boy in the box, the boy that nobody claimed. The media picked up the story immediately. The Philadelphia Inquirer ran a front-page story, "Mystery Boy Found Dead in Box." Within days, it was national news. The Boy in the Box. America's Unknown Child. The case that had no answers. Tips poured in by the hundreds. Every parent who'd lost a child, every person who thought they might know something, called the police. Each tip was followed up. Each lead was investigated. Every single one led nowhere. The police tried something unprecedented. They took photographs of the boy's body, dressed him in donated clothes, propped him up in a sitting position with his eyes open, and distributed the photos to every gas station, every store, every public building in the Philadelphia area. Thousands of people saw that photograph. The boy sitting there, dressed in simple clothes, his hair neatly combed despite the crude cut. His eyes open but empty. Looking at something no one else could see. Surely someone would recognize him. Surely someone would come forward. Nobody did. On March 1, 1957, just 4 days after his body was found, the boy was buried. The city of Philadelphia paid for the funeral. Local businesses donated a casket, a burial plot in Ivy Hill Cemetery. The gravestone was simple, heartbreaking in its simplicity. Heavenly Father, bless this unknown boy. February 25, 1957. Not even a name. Just, unknown boy. But the city didn't forget him. People began visiting the grave, leaving flowers, toys, small gifts. A tradition that would continue for 65 years. The medical examiner's report on the boy in the box became one of the most detailed and disturbing documents in Philadelphia Police Department history. Dr. Joseph Spellman spent hours examining every inch of the child's body, documenting every injury, every scar, every detail that might provide a clue to his identity or how he died. The boy was estimated to be between 4 and 6 years old, though his malnourished state made precise aging difficult. He was 40 inches tall and weighed only 30 pounds. To put that in perspective, a healthy 4-year-old boy typically weighs around 35 to 40 pounds. A healthy 6-year-old weighs around 45 to 50 pounds. This child was severely underweight for any age in that range. His hair was brown with a reddish tint, cut crudely within hours of his death. The hair that remained was about 2 to 3 inches long on top, shorter on the sides, but extremely uneven. Clumps had been cut away at odd angles, as if someone had been in a hurry or didn't care about the result. Several patches of hair were found in the box with his body, confirming the haircut had occurred very recently. What was most striking about the haircut was its desperation. This wasn't someone trying to make the child look presentable. This was someone trying to change his appearance quickly. But why? Was it to make identification more difficult? Had the boy's distinctive long hair been a recognizable feature? Or was there some other reason? The boy's eyes were blue. His teeth were in relatively good condition, suggesting he'd had at least some dental care at some point in his life, though not recently. There were no cavities, no obvious dental work, but also no records that matched his dental pattern in any database. His body bore the marks of systematic abuse over an extended period. Dr. Spellman counted 17 distinct areas of bruising in various stages of healing. The oldest bruises were fading, yellow-green, at least 2 to 3 weeks old. Others were fresher, purple and blue, maybe a week old. The newest were dark purple, almost black, inflicted at or very near the time of death. The pattern of bruising told a story. These weren't accidental injuries. They weren't the normal bumps and bruises of an active child. They were deliberate. Concentrated on areas of the body that would be covered by clothing. The back. The buttocks. The backs of the legs. Places where bruises could be hidden. The cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head. The boy had been struck multiple times with enough force to cause fatal injuries. There were at least 7 distinct impact sites on his skull. Some had caused fractures. Some had caused massive internal bleeding. Any one of them could have been fatal. Together, they ensured death was certain. But it was what Dr. Spellman found on the boy's hands and feet that added another layer of horror to the case. His fingers and toes were deeply wrinkled, pruned, as if he'd been submerged in water for hours. But there was no water in his lungs. He hadn't drowned. So why the pruning? The theory that developed was chilling. Someone had bathed this child extensively after death. Had scrubbed his body thoroughly, perhaps to remove evidence. The pruning of his fingers and toes suggested he'd been in water for 2 to 4 hours after he died. Someone had taken the time to carefully, methodically clean this small body. His fingernails had been recently trimmed, cut neat and straight. Again, this suggested care, preparation. Someone had groomed this child's body after killing him. It spoke to a level of calculation that made the crime even more disturbing. There were older scars on the boy's body as well. On his ankle was a surgical scar, about 2 inches long, fully healed. This was from a procedure performed at least a year before his death, possibly longer. What kind of procedure? The scar's location suggested it might have been related to a tendon or bone issue in the foot or ankle. This surgical scar was crucial evidence. It meant medical records existed somewhere. Some doctor had performed this procedure and would have documentation. Patient files. X-rays. Notes. Something that could identify this child. The Philadelphia Police Department launched a massive search. Every hospital in Philadelphia was contacted. Then every hospital in Pennsylvania. Then the entire tri-state area. Investigators pulled medical records for every male child between the ages of 3 and 7 who'd had foot or ankle surgery in the past 3 years. They found dozens of cases. Each one was investigated. Each child was accounted for. None of them matched the boy in the box. How was that possible? Had the surgery been performed in another state? In another country? Or had it been done off the book somehow, without official records? The boy's stomach contents provided another clue, though a disturbing one. His stomach was almost entirely empty. He had not eaten for at least 24 hours before his death, possibly longer. But there were small traces of food present that the medical examiner was able to analyze. The food fragments suggested his last meal had included baked beans and some kind of vegetable, possibly cut green beans or similar. This was significant because it was specific. If investigators could find where he'd been kept, they might find matching food items. But more disturbing was what the empty stomach suggested about his captivity. This child had been starved, systematically denied food. The chronic malnutrition evident in his body told the same story. This wasn't a case of poverty or neglect. This was deliberate starvation, carried out over weeks or months. Toxicology reports found no drugs or poisons in his system. He had not been sedated or drugged. Whatever happened to him, he'd been fully conscious for it. That reality made the case even harder for investigators to process. The blanket found wrapped around his body was analyzed in detail. It was a cheap plaid blanket, cotton blend, mass-produced and sold at numerous department stores across the Philadelphia area in the 1950s. The specific pattern had been manufactured by several companies and distributed widely. There was no way to trace it to a specific purchaser. The blanket did yield one piece of evidence, however. Several hairs were found embedded in the fabric. Some were the boys'. But others were different. Longer. Adult female hair, brown in color. These were carefully preserved. In 1957, DNA testing didn't exist, but investigators hoped that someday, technology might advance enough to make use of this evidence. The JCPenney bassinet box itself was examined thoroughly. It was a standard container used to ship bassinets from the manufacturer to the store. The specific model number on the box indicated it had been manufactured in late 1956, just a few months before the boy's body was found. Detectives traced the distribution of these specific boxes. They were sent to JCPenney stores across Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware. Dozens of stores. Thousands of boxes. There was no way to trace this specific box to a specific purchase or location. But the box told investigators something important. Whoever put the boy's body in this box had access to it. Had they worked at a JCPenney store? Had they recently purchased a bassinet? Or had they simply found the box discarded somewhere? Police visited every JCPenney store in the region. They interviewed employees. They checked sales records for bassinet purchases in the weeks before the murder. They found several dozen purchases, each one investigated. Each purchaser was located and interviewed. None had any connection to the case. The handkerchief found near the body was plain white cotton, no identifying marks, no monogram, mass-produced and available anywhere. It yielded no useful evidence. The blue corduroy cap found about 100 yards from the scene was more interesting. It was men's size medium, relatively new, with no identifying marks. The style was common in the 1950s, sold at numerous stores. Inside the cap, investigators found several short brown hairs. Male hairs, not matching the boy's hair. Could this cap have belonged to the killer? Had it fallen off while he was disposing of the body? Or was it simply unrelated, trash that happened to be in the area? The cap was preserved as evidence, but without DNA testing technology, there was no way to definitively link it to anyone. The hairs inside were photographed, measured, and stored away. Investigators also carefully documented the crime scene itself. The location where the body was found was a wooded area about 15 feet from Susquehanna Road in Fox Chase. The area was remote enough for privacy but close enough to the road that someone could park briefly, dispose of the body, and leave quickly without being seen. The ground where the box had been placed was examined. There were no footprints, no tire tracks, nothing that suggested how the killer had arrived or departed. It had rained heavily 2 days before the body was discovered, which may have washed away any traces. But the placement of the box was deliberate. It wasn't thrown from the road. It wasn't hidden deep in the woods. It was placed carefully, about 15 feet from the road, in a spot where it would likely be discovered but not immediately. This suggested the killer wanted the body found. Not right away, but eventually. Why? Did they feel guilt? Remorse? Or was there some other motivation? One detail about the crime scene troubled investigators. The area was relatively open, visible from the road if you knew where to look. Yet the body had been there for at least 2 days before the college student found it. That young man who'd been checking his traps had seen it 2 days earlier and said nothing. How many other people had driven past? Had seen something but dismissed it? Had looked away? The police conducted extensive interviews in the neighborhood. They knocked on every door within a mile of the crime scene. Did anyone see a car parked on Susquehanna Road on February 23, 24th, or 25th? Did anyone see someone carrying anything? Did anyone hear anything unusual? The interviews yielded nothing concrete. Several residents reported seeing various cars parked along Susquehanna Road over those days, but the descriptions were vague and contradictory. No one had seen anyone carrying a box or acting suspiciously. One woman reported seeing a man and a young boy walking in the area on February 23, 2 days before the body was found. The man was carrying something, maybe a box or a bundle. But her description was vague. Middle-aged, average height, dark coat. The boy was small, wearing a blue coat or jacket. Police tried to follow up on this lead, but the woman couldn't provide more details. She hadn't thought anything of it at the time. Just a father and son out for a walk. She only remembered it after hearing about the body being found and wondered if it could be connected. Was this the killer disposing of the body? Or just an innocent father and son who happened to be in the area? Without more information, there was no way to know. The forensic evidence painted a clear picture of systematic abuse followed by murder. But it provided frustratingly few leads about who the boy was or who had killed him. Every piece of evidence was mass-produced, untraceable, anonymous. It was as if the killer had carefully planned every detail to ensure the boy could never be identified and they could never be caught. But they had made one mistake. They had left DNA evidence in the form of those hairs on the blanket. In 1957, that evidence was useless. But investigators preserved it carefully, hoping that someday, science would catch up. That someday would come. But not for another 65 years. Detective Samuel Weinstein became the lead investigator on the boy in the box case, and it would consume the rest of his career. He was a methodical man, detail-oriented, the kind of detective who never let a case go until it was solved. He thought this case would take a few weeks, maybe a couple of months at most. He was still working on it when he retired 25 years later. The initial investigation was massive in scope. The Philadelphia Police Department threw enormous resources at the case. This was a murdered child, abandoned like garbage. The public demanded answers. The media covered every development. The pressure to solve it was immense. The first priority was identifying the boy. Without knowing who he was, there was no way to determine who might have killed him or why. So the investigation focused on the question, who was this child? Missing persons reports were the logical starting point. Every unsolved case involving a missing boy between the ages of 3 and 8 was pulled from files across Pennsylvania. Then the search expanded to neighboring states. Then the entire country. Investigators compiled a list of over 400 missing children who potentially matched the boy's description. Each case was examined in detail. Each family was contacted. Physical descriptions were compared. Dental records were reviewed. Photographs were analyzed. One by one, every case was eliminated. Each missing child was accounted for in some way, or didn't match the physical evidence. Some had been found alive. Some had been found dead but were clearly different children. Some were ruled out based on timing, location, or physical characteristics. By June 1957, 4 months after the body was found, all 400 cases had been investigated and eliminated. The boy remained unidentified. The police tried a different approach. They prepared a bulletin with the boy's description, photograph, and all known details. This bulletin was sent to every police department, every FBI field office, every social services agency, every hospital, and every school district in the United States. The bulletin asked a simple question: do you know this child? Responses came from across the country. Hundreds of tips. Dozens of potential leads. People who thought they recognized the boy. People who remembered seeing a child who looked like him. People who had suspicions about a neighbor or relative. Every single tip was investigated. Detectives traveled to other states to follow up on promising leads. They interviewed hundreds of people. They checked countless alibi and eliminated suspect after suspect. None of it led anywhere. One of the more promising early leads came from a woman in New Jersey who contacted police in March 1957. She claimed she'd seen a boy matching the description at a bus station in Camden, New Jersey, about a week before the body was found. He'd been with a woman who seemed nervous, distracted. The woman had been arguing with the boy in a foreign language, possibly Hungarian or Romanian. Detectives tracked down every Hungarian and Romanian immigrant family in the Camden area. They interviewed dozens of people. They found no evidence of a missing child matching the description. Another lead came from a man in Delaware who was convinced the boy was his neighbor's child. The neighbor was a strange man, antisocial, who'd had a young boy living with him for a while. Then suddenly the boy was gone. The neighbor claimed the child had gone to live with relatives. Detectives investigated thoroughly. They tracked down the neighbor, interviewed him extensively, verified his story. The boy had indeed gone to live with relatives in Ohio. He was alive and well. Another dead end. A woman in Maryland called to report that she'd seen a couple disposing of something large wrapped in a blanket on the side of a rural road around the same time the body was estimated to have been left. She'd been driving past late at night and hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now she wondered if it could be connected. Detectives traveled to Maryland to investigate. They searched the area the woman described. They interviewed her repeatedly to nail down exact dates and times. Eventually, they determined the timing didn't match. Whatever she'd seen, it wasn't related to the boy in the box. The investigation expanded to include foster care systems, orphanages, and state institutions. Could the boy have been a ward of the state? A child in foster care who'd been abused by his caretakers? Every foster child in Pennsylvania who matched the age range was accounted for. Then the search expanded to New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, and New York. Thousands of records were reviewed. Social workers were interviewed. Foster parents were questioned. Again, nothing. Every child was accounted for. How was this possible? How could a child simply not exist in any official capacity? Even if he'd been born at home, never registered, never given a birth certificate, someone should have known about him. Neighbors. Relatives. Someone. Detective Weinstein developed a theory. He believed the boy had been kept prisoner his entire life, or at least for a significant portion of it. Hidden away from the world. Never allowed to go to school, never taken to a doctor except for that one surgery, never photographed, never documented. But why? What kind of person keeps a child hidden like that? And then murders him and disposes of his body? The answer, Weinstein believed, was someone who had obtained the child illegally. Someone who'd taken him or bought him and couldn't risk anyone knowing he existed. This theory led to investigations into illegal adoption rings and child trafficking. In the 1950s, there was a darker side to adoption that many people preferred not to acknowledge. Babies and young children were sometimes sold, sometimes stolen, placed with families who asked no questions and paid cash. Detectives investigated known illegal adoption facilitators in the Philadelphia area. They found several operators who'd been involved in questionable placements. Each was questioned extensively. Each denied any knowledge of the boy. Without concrete evidence linking any of them to the case, the investigation stalled. The photograph of the boy, the one taken post-mortem with his eyes open and his body propped up, was distributed widely. It appeared in newspapers across the country. It was posted in police stations, post offices, bus stations, anywhere the public might see it. That photograph became iconic, and deeply controversial. Many people were disturbed by the idea of photographing a dead child and distributing the image. But investigators argued it was necessary. Without that photograph, how could anyone recognize him? The strategy generated thousands of responses but no concrete leads. Person after person called to say they thought they recognized the boy, but each identification proved false. Some people were genuinely mistaken, thinking the boy looked like a cousin or neighbor's child they'd lost track of. Others were, frankly, seeking attention or suffering from mental health issues. Every call was investigated anyway. Detectives couldn't afford to dismiss any possibility, no matter how unlikely. By the end of 1957, the investigation was running out of steam. Leads were drying up. The massive task force that had been assembled was gradually reassigned to other cases. Detective Weinstein continued working the case, but he was increasingly alone in his obsession. The public interest, which had been intense for the first few months, began to fade. Other stories dominated the news. Life moved on. But Weinstein couldn't move on. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that small body in that box, carefully positioned, carefully cleaned, carefully discarded. He'd made a promise to that boy. He'd promised to find out who he was. He'd promised justice. And he wasn't about to give up. In 1958, a breakthrough seemed to come from an unexpected direction. A psychic contacted the Philadelphia Police Department, claiming she had information about the case. She said she'd had a vision of the boy. She knew where he'd come from. She knew who had killed him. Normally, Weinstein was skeptical of psychics. But he was desperate enough to listen. The woman described a house in the Fox Chase area, not far from where the body had been found. She described a woman with mental illness who'd been keeping the boy prisoner. She described how the boy had died. Against his better judgment, Weinstein followed up on the lead. He couldn't find the house the psychic described. He couldn't find any evidence to support her claims. It was another dead end, another wasted effort. But the psychic's story stayed with him. Not because he believed in psychic visions, but because some of the details she'd mentioned resonated with his own theories about the case. The idea of a mentally ill woman keeping a child hidden. The idea of the boy being a prisoner. That same year, another potential lead emerged. A gas station attendant in northeast Philadelphia came forward with information. He remembered a man and a young boy coming into his station in late February 1957, just before the body was found. The man had been agitated, nervous. He'd asked for directions, then abruptly left without buying gas. The attendant described the boy as quiet, sad-looking. He'd been wearing a blue jacket, the same color mentioned by the woman who'd seen a man and boy walking near the crime scene. Weinstein interviewed the attendant extensively. He worked with a police sketch artist to create a composite of the man's face. The sketch was circulated widely. Several people called to say they recognized the man, but each lead evaporated upon investigation. The blue jacket became another focus. If the boy had been wearing a blue jacket when last seen alive, where was it? It hadn't been found with the body. Had the killer kept it? Disposed of it separately? Was it sitting in a landfill somewhere, or hanging in someone's closet? Police issued bulletins asking anyone who'd found a child's blue jacket in the Fox Chase area to come forward. Several jackets were turned in. None matched the description or had any forensic evidence linking them to the case. By 1960, 3 years after the murder, the boy in the box case had officially gone cold. There were no active leads. No new developments. The file was marked as unsolved and moved to the cold case archive. But Detective Weinstein kept working. On his own time, during his lunch breaks, on his days off. He couldn't let it go. His wife worried about his obsession. His colleagues thought he needed to move on. But Weinstein believed that somewhere, in all the evidence they'd collected, in all the interviews they'd conducted, the answer was hiding. He reviewed the case file repeatedly. He re-interviewed witnesses. He followed up on old leads that had been dismissed. He became known in the department as the detective who couldn't let go of the dead boy. In 1963, 6 years after the murder, Weinstein convinced his superiors to allow him to exhume the boy's body. Medical technology had advanced. Maybe a new examination would reveal something that had been missed in the original autopsy. The exhumation took place quietly, without media attention. The boy's small casket was removed from the grave at Ivy Hill Cemetery and transported to the medical examiner's office. A new autopsy was conducted. Every inch of the body was examined again. X-rays were taken. Measurements were recorded. Tissue samples were preserved. The new examination confirmed everything from the original autopsy but revealed nothing new. The boy had been beaten to death. He'd been malnourished. He'd had surgery on his ankle. Beyond that, his body had no more secrets to tell. The boy was reburied, and the investigation continued to languish. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, the case would periodically resurface. A new detective would be assigned to review it. A new tip would come in. The media would run an anniversary story. But nothing ever broke the case open. Detective Weinstein retired in 1982, 25 years after finding that small body in the box. He'd worked hundreds of cases in his career, solved most of them, earned commendations and promotions. But the boy in the box haunted him until his death in 1988. At his funeral, his daughter revealed that her father had kept a photograph of the boy on his desk at home for decades. Every day, he'd look at that photograph and renew his promise. Someday, he'd told his family, someone will solve this case. Someone will give that boy his name back. He just never imagined it would take 65 years. Over the decades, numerous theories emerged about who the boy in the box was and what had happened to him. Some were based on credible evidence and witness testimony. Others were wild speculation. A few came tantalizingly close to the truth but could never be definitively proven. This chapter examines the major theories that have been investigated over the years, the evidence supporting each one, and why none of them could be confirmed until 2022. Theory 1: The foster home. The most persistent and detailed theory about the boy in the box case came from a woman identified only as M, who came forward in 1998, 41 years after the murder. M contacted the Philadelphia Police Department through an intermediary, a psychiatrist who'd been treating her for severe mental health issues. According to M, she had information about the boy in the box. She claimed she'd witnessed the murder. M's story was elaborate and deeply disturbing. She claimed that in 1954, when she was 10 years old, her abusive mother had purchased a boy from his birth parents who couldn't afford to keep him. The transaction took place in a department store, where money was exchanged and the boy was handed over. According to M., her mother brought the boy home to their house in the Fox Chase area of Philadelphia, very close to where the body would later be found. But the boy wasn't treated as a family member. He was kept as a slave, essentially. Forced to do housework, beaten regularly, denied food as punishment. M claimed the boy was never allowed outside. He was kept hidden in the basement most of the time, brought up only when her mother needed him to clean or do chores. He wasn't given a name. He was just the boy. In February 1957, according to M's account, her mother had been bathing the boy in the basement. Something had gone wrong. Had the boy resisted? Had he talked back? M's story was unclear on this point, varying in different tellings. What M was clear about was what happened next. Her mother had beaten the boy savagely in a rage. She'd struck him repeatedly in the head. M had been present, forced to watch. She described the boy's head hitting the floor, the sound of the impacts, the blood. The boy had died there in the basement. Panicking, M's mother had ordered her daughter to help clean up. They'd bathed the boy's body extensively, scrubbing away blood and evidence. Her mother had cut the boy's hair, hacking at it frantically to change his appearance. Then they'd wrapped him in a blanket and placed him in a bassinet box that her mother had recently purchased. According to M., she and her mother had driven to Susquehanna Road in the middle of the night and disposed of the body in the woods. Then they'd returned home and never spoke of it again. M's story contained numerous specific details that seemed to match the evidence. The location of her mother's house was indeed in Fox Chase, within a mile of where the body was found. The basement bathing matched the pruned condition of the boy's fingers and toes. The crude haircut matched the evidence. The bassinet box matched. Investigators were intrigued but cautious. M had a history of severe mental illness. She'd been hospitalized multiple times. She suffered from dissociative disorders and had described other traumatic memories that couldn't be verified. Was this story real, or was it a false memory, a delusion? The investigation into M's claims was extensive. Detectives tracked down her mother, who was still alive in the late 1990s. But by the time they found her, she was in advanced stages of dementia and couldn't be meaningfully interviewed. She died shortly after without ever addressing M's accusations. Investigators searched for evidence to corroborate M's story. They found the house where M and her mother had lived in 1957. The current owners allowed them to search the basement. They brought in forensic teams with luminol, looking for traces of blood. They found nothing. If a murder had occurred in that basement 40 years earlier, any evidence had long since been destroyed or degraded beyond detection. Investigators tried to verify M's claim that her mother had purchased a boy from his birth parents. They searched for any records of the transaction, any witnesses who might have seen the boy at the house, any neighbors who remembered a boy living there. Again, nothing. No one remembered seeing a boy at that house. No records existed of any transaction. It was as if M's entire story existed only in her memory. The bassinet box was particularly problematic. M claimed her mother had purchased a bassinet shortly before the murder, which explained why they had the box. But investigators could find no record of M's mother purchasing a bassinet from any store in the area. No receipts, no credit card records, nothing. In 2002, investigators tried a new approach. They asked M to take a polygraph test about her claims. She agreed. The results were inconclusive. The examiner noted that M's mental health issues made it difficult to get a reliable reading. She clearly believed her story was true, but that didn't mean it was. The most frustrating aspect of M's theory was that it was internally consistent and matched many of the case facts, but couldn't be proven or disproven. Without physical evidence, without witnesses, without her mother available to confess or deny, there was no way to move forward. Some investigators believed M completely. They thought she'd witnessed exactly what she described and had been carrying that trauma for 4 decades. Others were skeptical, believing M's mental illness had caused her to construct a false memory, perhaps incorporating details she'd read about the case in the media. The theory remains controversial to this day. When the boy was finally identified in 2022, it didn't definitively prove or disprove M's story. Joseph Augustus Zarelli's family situation had some parallels to M's account but also significant differences. The truth remained elusive. Theory 2, the illegitimate child. Another persistent theory was that the boy in the box was the illegitimate child of a prominent family who'd been keeping him hidden to avoid scandal. In the 1950s, having a child out of wedlock was deeply shameful, especially for wealthy or socially prominent families. Some families went to extraordinary lengths to hide such situations, sending pregnant daughters away, arranging secret adoptions, or in extreme cases, keeping children hidden. This theory suggested that the boy was the result of an affair or an inappropriate relationship. The family had kept him hidden, possibly planning to eventually arrange an adoption or placement. But something had gone wrong. Perhaps the child had become ill or injured and they'd panicked. Perhaps someone had lost their temper during discipline. Perhaps the stress of keeping him hidden had become too much. Whatever the reason, they'd killed him and disposed of his body, hoping he'd never be identified and the scandal would remain buried. Evidence supporting this theory included the boy's generally healthy teeth, suggesting he'd received some dental care. The surgical scar indicated he'd received medical attention at some point. These suggested a family with some resources, not extreme poverty. The care taken with the body after death also suggested someone from a higher social class. The extensive bathing, the grooming, the almost ritualistic preparation. This wasn't someone who killed in a rage and immediately disposed of the body. This was someone who took time, who perhaps felt some guilt or remorse. Investigators looked into prominent Philadelphia families with potential scandals. They investigated rumors of hidden pregnancies, illegitimate children, family secrets. But the 1950s were a different era. People didn't talk about such things. Records were sealed or destroyed. Leads evaporated into dead ends. One particular lead involved a wealthy mainline family with rumored connections to an illegitimate child. An anonymous tip in the 1960s claimed the family had been keeping a boy hidden at a property they owned in Delaware County, about 20 miles from Philadelphia. Detectives investigated thoroughly. They interviewed family members, staff, neighbors. They found no evidence of any hidden child. The family denied everything and threatened legal action if the harassment continued. The investigation was dropped. Another version of this theory suggested the child might have been the result of incest, which would explain the desperate need to keep him hidden. A daughter pregnant by her father, or a similar situation, might explain why the family couldn't acknowledge the child's existence but also couldn't simply give him up for adoption. This theory was particularly difficult to investigate because families involved in such situations would have had enormous motivation to hide all evidence. And in the 1950s, before DNA testing, before modern investigative techniques, it would have been relatively easy to make a child disappear. The illegitimate child theory remained plausible but unprovable. Without specific families to investigate, without concrete evidence pointing in any particular direction, it was simply one possibility among many. Theory 3, the Carney Kid. A more exotic theory suggested the boy might have been part of a traveling carnival or circus. These operations frequently employed children, some legally, some not. Children who were orphans or runaways sometimes attached themselves to carnivals, working for food and a place to sleep. In February 1957, several carnivals had been in the Philadelphia area for winter maintenance and preparation. Most had permanent or semi-permanent facilities in South Jersey or Delaware where they'd spend the off-season. This theory suggested the boy might have been injured in an accident at one of these facilities. Or perhaps he'd been abused by someone working for the carnival. When he died, rather than report it and face legal consequences, the carnival workers had disposed of his body. The theory explained several aspects of the case. It explained why no missing persons report was filed. Carnival children often had no legal guardians, no official records. It explained the surgical scar. Carnival medicine was often primitive, performed by whoever had some medical knowledge. It explained why no one came forward to claim him. The carnival had moved on, and no one in the operation wanted to admit involvement. Investigators tracked down several carnivals that had been in the area. They interviewed operators and workers. They looked at employment records, such as they were. They found nothing connecting any carnival to the case. The theory had other problems. The boy's general condition suggested he'd been kept indoors, hidden away. His pale skin showed no signs of the sun exposure a carnival child would have had. His malnourishment suggested systematic starvation, not just the hardship of carnival life. Still, some investigators found the theory compelling because it explained the lack of records. Carnival children existed on the margins of society. They could disappear without a trace. But without evidence, the Carney Kid theory remained speculation. Theory 4, the medical experiment victim. One of the darker theories to emerge over the years suggested the boy might have been a victim of illegal medical experimentation. The 1950s were a time when medical ethics were far less stringent than today. There were documented cases of unethical experiments performed on vulnerable populations, prisoners, institutionalized children, poor communities. Could the boy in the box have been one such victim? This theory was based primarily on the surgical scar. What if it wasn't from a legitimate medical procedure but from an experimental surgery? What if the boy had been obtained illegally specifically for medical research? When the experiment was complete, or when something went wrong, the researchers had disposed of the body, taking care to remove any evidence that might link back to them. The extensive bathing could have been to remove traces of medical procedures. The haircut could have been to remove evidence of where he'd been kept. Investigators looked into medical research facilities in the Philadelphia area. In the 1950s, Philadelphia was a major center for medical research. Numerous hospitals and universities conducted studies. Some later proved to have serious ethical problems. But finding any evidence linking a research facility to the boy in the box proved impossible. Medical institutions were understandably defensive about such accusations. Records were sealed. Access was denied. Without specific evidence pointing to a specific facility, the investigation went nowhere. The theory also had logical problems. Why would medical researchers kill a child and dispose of him so carelessly? They had access to better means of disposal, cremation, burial in unmarked graves, other methods that would have been far more secure. The medical experiment theory appealed to those who wanted to believe in vast conspiracies, but most investigators found it implausible. Theory 5, the stranger abduction. The simplest theory was that the boy had been abducted by a stranger, abused for a period of time, and then killed when he became too difficult to control or when the abductor feared discovery. This theory required the fewest assumptions. It didn't require elaborate conspiracies or hidden families. It just required one sick individual who'd taken a child and done horrible things to him. The pattern of abuse evident on the boy's body suggested sadistic pleasure, not just discipline or punishment. The systematic starvation, the beatings, the ultimate murder, these pointed to someone who enjoyed hurting children. Investigators compiled lists of known child predators in the Philadelphia area. They interviewed registered sex offenders. They looked at unsolved cases involving child abuse or abduction. They searched for any pattern that might connect to the boy in the box. They found several suspects who seemed promising. Men with histories of child abuse, with access to the Fox Chase area, with no alibi for late February 1957. Each was investigated thoroughly. Each was eventually eliminated. The problem with the stranger abduction theory was the same as the problem with all the theories. Without knowing who the boy was, there was no way to work backward to figure out who had taken him. No starting point. No connections to investigate. The boy could have been abducted from anywhere, Philadelphia, the suburbs, another state entirely. He could have been held for days or weeks or months before being killed. The abductor could have been anyone, a neighbor, a relative, a complete stranger passing through. Without a missing persons report that matched the boy, without any witness who'd seen an abduction, without any physical evidence connecting a specific suspect to the crime, the stranger abduction theory was just another possibility in a case full of possibilities. Theory 6, the wrong place wrong time accident. A minority theory suggested that the boy's death might have been, at least initially, an accident that was then covered up. Perhaps the boy was living in an abusive situation, being systematically neglected and abused. Perhaps one day the abuse went too far, and he died from injuries that weren't intended to be fatal. The people responsible panicked. They couldn't report his death without admitting to the abuse. So they disposed of his body, hoping to avoid consequences. This theory attempted to explain the careful preparation of the body after death. It suggested not a sadistic killer but frightened people trying to hide evidence of abuse that had gone tragically, fatally wrong. The theory had some support from the medical evidence. While the boy had clearly been beaten to death, beaten with terrible force and intent, it was possible to construct a scenario where discipline had escalated out of control, where someone had lost their temper and killed him without necessarily intending to. But the systematic starvation, the pattern of old and new bruises, the evidence of prolonged abuse, these argued against any kind of accident. This was someone who'd been hurting this child for a long time. His death might not have been planned for that specific day, but it was probably inevitable given the level of abuse he was enduring. Most investigators gave little credence to the accident theory. The evidence suggested deliberate, sustained cruelty culminating in murder. Theory 7, the institutionalized child. Another theory suggested the boy might have escaped or been removed from a state institution, an orphanage, a mental hospital, a facility for troubled children. In the 1950s, conditions in such institutions were often horrific. Abuse was common. Children were sometimes treated more as inmates than as patients or wards. If a child died under suspicious circumstances, it wouldn't be unprecedented for administrators to cover it up rather than face investigation. This theory suggested the boy had been in such an institution, had suffered abuse there, and had died from that abuse. To avoid scandal and legal consequences, someone had removed his body and disposed of it, making it look like he'd never been at the institution at all. Investigators checked records from every state institution in Pennsylvania that housed children. They looked at admission records, discharge records, death records. They looked for gaps, for inconsistencies, for any sign that a child had disappeared without proper documentation. They found numerous problems with record-keeping at various institutions. Children who'd been admitted and never formally discharged. Deaths that weren't properly reported. Runaways whose disappearances weren't investigated. But they found no specific case that matched the boy in the box. No child of the right age, with the right physical characteristics, who disappeared at the right time. The institution theory remained possible but, like so many others, unprovable. The problem with all the theories. Each theory had evidence to support it. Each had passionate advocates among investigators and amateur detectives. But each also had significant gaps, questions that couldn't be answered, connections that couldn't be made. The fundamental problem was always the same: without knowing who the boy was, there was no way to investigate his life, his family, his circumstances. Every theory was built on speculation and interpretation of limited physical evidence. It was like trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing. You could see outlines, possibilities, but never the complete picture. Investigators were convinced that someone, somewhere, knew what had happened. The boy's mother or father, if they were still alive. Siblings, if he had any. Neighbors who'd seen him. Someone who'd been there when he died. But that person or those people had kept silent for decades. Through all the media coverage, all the public appeals, all the investigations, no one had come forward with information that cracked the case. Why? Fear of prosecution was the obvious answer. If you were involved in a child's death, even accidentally, even as a witness, you'd have powerful motivation to stay silent. But it might have been more than fear. In some families, in some situations, secrets are kept not out of fear but out of shame, loyalty, or simply habit. Some families are so dysfunctional that hiding a murdered child seems rational, necessary, possible. The boy in the box represented all the dark possibilities of American family life in the 1950s. A time when children had fewer rights, when abuse was less likely to be reported, when families could keep terrible secrets hidden behind closed doors. By the 1990s, investigators had largely given up hope of ever identifying the boy through traditional means. Every conventional avenue had been exhausted. Every theory had been investigated as far as possible without new evidence. The case seemed destined to remain forever unsolved, the boy forever unknown. And then science began to catch up. The 1990s brought revolutionary changes to criminal investigation. DNA testing, which had been developed in the 1980s, became more sophisticated and accessible. Cold cases that had been unsolvable for decades suddenly had new life. In 1998, the Philadelphia Police Department made a decision. They would exhume the boy in the box one more time and collect DNA samples using modern techniques. If they couldn't identify him through traditional investigation, perhaps science could do what decades of detective work could not. The exhumation took place on October 18, 1998, 41 years after the boy's murder. By now, he'd been buried and exhumed 3 times. Each time, investigators hoped for answers. Each time, they'd been disappointed. This time felt different. Technology had advanced so far beyond what had been available in 1957. Surely modern forensic science could extract information that earlier examinations had missed. DNA samples were carefully collected from the boy's remains. hair samples, tooth pulp, bone fragments. Each was preserved and sent to the FBI laboratory for analysis. The DNA profile that emerged was clear and complete. For the first time, investigators had a genetic blueprint of the boy in the box. If they could find a relative, if they could find someone with matching DNA, they could finally identify him. The problem was finding someone to compare the DNA against. The boy's DNA was entered into CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system. This database contained DNA profiles from convicted criminals, missing persons, and unidentified remains. If there was a match in the system, it would be found. There was no match. Investigators tried another approach. They publicized the DNA profile and asked for volunteers to submit their DNA for comparison. If anyone suspected they might be related to the boy, they could provide a sample and find out. A few dozen people came forward over the years. Elderly individuals who'd had siblings disappear in the 1950s. Adult children of suspicious parents who wondered if their family might be connected. Each was tested. Each was eliminated. The DNA evidence proved valuable for eliminating theories, even if it couldn't yet identify the boy. The hair found on the blanket wrapped around his body was tested. It did belong to an adult female, as suspected. But without a suspect to compare it against, it was just another piece of evidence waiting for context. In 2002, a new investigator was assigned to review the case. His name was Tom Augustine, and he brought fresh eyes and new energy to an investigation that had been stagnant for years. Augustine was part of a new generation of detectives who'd grown up with computers and databases. He understood how to leverage technology in ways that earlier investigators couldn't have imagined. He began by digitizing the entire case file. Thousands of pages of reports, interviews, tips, and theories were scanned and made searchable. This allowed him to find connections and patterns that might have been missed when everything existed only on paper. Augustine also reached out to amateur investigators, the growing community of people fascinated by cold cases who spent their free time researching unsolved mysteries. He created a website dedicated to the boy in the box case, sharing information and asking for help. The response was overwhelming. Hundreds of amateur detectives began researching the case, following up on old leads, proposing new theories. Some of their work was helpful, providing fresh perspectives on old evidence. Some was distracting, based on conspiracy theories and wild speculation. But Augustine welcomed all of it. He believed that somewhere in the mass of information, someone might spot the detail that cracked the case. In 2004, Augustine pursued a new angle. He began researching traveling carnivals and circuses that had been in the Philadelphia area in early 1957. This was the "Carny Kid" theory revisited with modern investigative tools. Using internet databases and digital archives, Augustine was able to track down former carnival workers who'd been in the area at the right time. He interviewed dozens of them, now elderly, asking about missing children, suspicious deaths, anything that might connect to the case. One interview seemed promising. An elderly man who'd worked for a traveling show in the 1950s remembered a young boy who'd been with the carnival for a few weeks in late 1956. The boy had no parents with him, which was unusual even for carnival life. Then suddenly, the boy was gone. No explanation. No one talked about it. Augustine investigated thoroughly. He tried to find other carnival workers who might remember the boy. He looked for any documentation of the child's presence. But the carnival had operated on the fringes of legality, keeping minimal records. Everyone who might have known anything more was dead or untraceable. Another lead that couldn't be proven or disproven. In 2008, Augustine tried yet another approach. He worked with a forensic artist to create an age progression image of what the boy might have looked like if he'd lived. The idea was to imagine him as a teenager, as a young adult, to see if anyone recognized him at different ages. The age progression images were widely circulated but generated no useful leads. How could they? The boy was dead. He'd never aged beyond 4 years old. The exercise was more about keeping public attention on the case than any realistic hope of identification. As the 50th anniversary of the murder approached in 2007, there was renewed media interest. Newspapers ran retrospective stories. Television programs featured the case. Once again, the boy in the box was front-page news in Philadelphia. The anniversary coverage generated a surge of new tips, new theories, new volunteers offering to help. Augustine and his team investigated everything, but 50 years of accumulated misinformation and speculation made it difficult to separate credible leads from noise. One positive development from the anniversary coverage was increased cooperation between law enforcement agencies. Police departments in New Jersey, Delaware, and Maryland agreed to review their own cold cases for any possible connection to the boy in the box. If he'd been abducted from another jurisdiction, maybe there was a missing persons case that had never been properly cross-referenced. The review found several cases of missing boys from the mid-1950s that had never been definitively solved. Each was investigated in detail. DNA comparisons were made where possible. Each was eventually eliminated as a match to the boy in the box. By 2010, Augustine was frustrated. He'd tried every angle he could think of. He'd used every tool available to modern law enforcement. But the boy remained unidentified. He began to accept what some investigators had believed for years: the boy would never be identified through traditional means. His identity had died with him in 1957. Without a breakthrough, without some new technology or unexpected witness coming forward, the case would remain unsolved forever. Augustine retired in 2014, joining the long line of detectives who'd worked the case and failed to solve it. He'd given it 7 years of his life. He'd tried everything he could think of. But the boy's name remained a mystery. The case went quiet again. New investigators were assigned, but with limited resources and numerous other cold cases demanding attention. The boy in the box file was reviewed periodically, but no active investigation was underway. The 60th anniversary in 2017 brought another round of media coverage, but by now the story felt familiar, tragic, unsolvable. The boy in the box. America's unknown child. The case that had no answers. Visitors still came to his grave at Ivy Hill Cemetery. Still left flowers and toys. Still remembered him even though they'd never known his name. The city of Philadelphia had adopted this murdered child as one of their own, determined that he wouldn't be forgotten even if he couldn't be identified. But technology was advancing faster than anyone realized. And a new field was emerging that would finally, after 65 years, give the boy his name back. Genetic genealogy. In 2018, the technique exploded into public consciousness when it was used to identify the Golden State Killer, a serial murderer and rapist who'd evaded capture for decades. Investigators had used DNA from crime scenes and compared it against public genealogy databases, tracing family trees until they identified a suspect. The technique was revolutionary. It meant that even without a direct DNA match, investigators could identify unknown persons by finding their relatives and working backward through family trees. The Philadelphia Police Department immediately recognized the potential. If genetic genealogy could identify the Golden State Killer, maybe it could identify the boy in the box. In 2019, the department partnered with a genetic genealogy firm and submitted the boy's DNA for analysis. The process was slow, painstaking work. Genealogists compared the boy's DNA against millions of profiles in public databases, looking for matches that indicated family relationships. Partial matches began to emerge. Distant cousins, second cousins once removed, people who shared small amounts of DNA with the boy. Each match became a starting point for building a family tree. The genealogists worked backward through generations, identifying common ancestors, mapping out family lines, trying to narrow down which branch of which family the boy might have come from. It took months of work. Dead ends were common. Family trees split in multiple directions. Some branches had insufficient records to trace. Some family members had died without having children, ending potential lines of investigation. But slowly, painstakingly, a picture began to emerge. The boy's family appeared to have roots in the Philadelphia area, going back generations. The genealogists identified several possible family lines he might have come from. Then came the pandemic. COVID-19 shut down much of the world in 2020. The genetic genealogy work on the boy in the box case slowed but didn't stop. Genealogists worked from home, accessing digital records, building their family trees remotely. By late 2021, they'd narrowed the possibilities significantly. The boy appeared to be descended from a specific cluster of families in the Philadelphia area. The genealogists identified several individuals who were likely close relatives, siblings, parents, aunts, or uncles. The challenge now was finding living descendants of these families who could provide DNA samples for comparison. Many of the people who would have known the boy were long dead. But their children and grandchildren might still be alive. Investigators began the delicate process of reaching out to potential relatives. Many were shocked to learn they might be connected to one of Philadelphia's most famous cold cases. Some were eager to help. Others were reluctant, concerned about what family secrets might be uncovered. DNA samples were collected and compared. One by one, family lines were either confirmed or eliminated. And then, in October 2022, 65 years and 8 months after the boy's body was found in that box, the genealogists found the match they'd been seeking. They'd identified his family. They'd traced his lineage. And finally, after all those years, they could give him back his name. Joseph Augustus Zarelli. December 8, 2022. The Philadelphia Police Department held a press conference that had been 65 years in the making. Police Commissioner Danielle Outlaw stood at the podium, flanked by detectives and representatives from the genetic genealogy firm that had finally cracked the case. Behind her was a screen showing a photograph that the public had never seen before, the boy in the box as he might have looked in life, smiling, alive. Today, Commissioner Outlaw began, her voice steady but emotional, "We are finally able to give this child his name back. For 65 years, he's been known as the boy in the box, as America's unknown child. But his name was Joseph Augustus Zarelli. And he deserves to be remembered by his name." The room erupted with questions from reporters, but Commissioner Outlaw raised her hand for silence. She continued, explaining how genetic genealogy had finally accomplished what 65 years of traditional investigation could not. Joseph Augustus Zarelli was born on January 13, 1953. He would have been just 4 years old when he died in February 1957, confirming what medical examiners had long suspected about his age. He was born in Philadelphia to parents who were struggling, both economically and personally. His father had a history of mental illness and instability. His mother was overwhelmed, trying to care for multiple children in difficult circumstances. The genetic genealogy work had identified Joseph's siblings, some of whom were still alive. Through careful and sensitive outreach, investigators had made contact with them. What they learned was heartbreaking but also provided some answers to questions that had haunted investigators for decades. Joseph had lived with his parents in West Philadelphia, not Fox Chase where his body was found. The family was poor, living in crowded conditions. There were several children, and Joseph was not the oldest or the youngest. He was, in some ways, lost in the middle. According to family members who'd been children themselves at the time, Joseph had been treated differently than his siblings. He'd been blamed for things, punished more severely, singled out. Whether this was due to behavioral issues on his part or simply scapegoating by troubled parents, no one could say for certain after all these years. What was clear was that Joseph had been in danger in his own home. The abuse documented on his body, the chronic malnourishment, the evidence of systematic cruelty, these had occurred while he was living with his family. At some point in late 1956 or early 1957, Joseph's parents had made a decision. What exactly that decision was, and whether both parents were involved or just one, remains unclear. The investigation into his death is ongoing, and police were careful about what details they could share publicly. What they could say was this: Joseph had been taken from the family home. He'd been held somewhere else, possibly for days or weeks. The abuse had continued and intensified. And then he'd been killed and his body disposed of in Fox Chase, miles from where he'd lived. The genetic genealogy had given Joseph his identity back, but it hadn't yet identified his killer. Both of his parents were long dead. Joseph's father had died in 1962, just 5 years after the murder. His mother had died in the 1990s. Neither had ever been publicly connected to the boy in the box case during their lifetimes. Were they responsible for his death? Were they involved but not directly responsible? Or had they given Joseph to someone else, someone who'd then abused and killed him? These questions remained unanswered at the time of the December 2022 press conference. The investigation was continuing, Commissioner Outlaw explained. They were interviewing family members, reviewing old records, trying to piece together exactly what had happened to Joseph in his final days. What they did know was that Joseph's siblings had not been told what happened to him. They'd been children themselves, between 3 and 10 years old. One day Joseph was there, and then he wasn't. They'd been told he'd gone to live with relatives, or he'd run away, or some other explanation that small children would accept without questioning too much. The siblings had grown up not knowing that their brother had been the boy in the box, the famous unsolved case that was regularly featured in the news. They'd had no idea that the murdered child everyone in Philadelphia talked about was their own sibling. Learning the truth in 2022 was devastating for them. One sister, speaking through a victim's advocate, said, "We thought he'd just gone away somewhere. We never knew. We never imagined. If we'd known, if we'd understood, maybe we could have said something years ago. But we were just children. We didn't know." The revelation of Joseph's identity sent shockwaves through Philadelphia and beyond. For 65 years, people had wondered who the boy was. They'd theorized and speculated. And now they knew. He'd been right there in Philadelphia the whole time, a child from a troubled family in West Philadelphia. Some of the theories investigators had pursued over the years proved to be partially correct. The idea that he'd been kept hidden, abused systematically by family members, turned out to be essentially accurate. But the elaborate scenarios involving wealthy families, illegal adoptions, medical experiments, those had been wrong. The truth was simpler and, in some ways, more tragic. Joseph had been killed by someone close to him, someone who should have protected him. He died because he was vulnerable, because he was small, because no one had been watching out for him. The M theory, which had consumed so much investigative time in the late 1990s and early 2000s, appeared to be completely false. M's mother had not been involved in Joseph's death. M's elaborate story of witnessing the murder in her mother's basement had been, as skeptical investigators had suspected, a false memory or delusion brought on by her mental illness and possibly influenced by details she'd read about the case. The revelation about Joseph's identity didn't bring the closure that some had hoped for. It answered one fundamental question: who was he? But raised many others. Who exactly had killed him? If his parents were involved, did anyone else help them? Were there accomplices who were still alive and might face prosecution? Philadelphia police made it clear that the criminal investigation was ongoing and active. They urged anyone with information about what happened to Joseph Augustus Zarelli in February 1957 to come forward. Even 65 years later, even with key suspects long dead, they wanted the complete truth. The genealogy firm that had identified Joseph released a statement explaining their methodology. They'd compared Joseph's DNA against profiles in public genealogy databases like GEDmatch, which allows law enforcement access for investigative purposes. They'd found several distant cousins, then painstakingly built family trees going back multiple generations. The breakthrough had come when they'd identified Joseph's grandparents and then traced forward through their descendants. By process of elimination, comparing DNA matches and investigating which children had gone missing or died in suspicious circumstances, they'd finally arrived at Joseph. The confirmation had come through DNA samples provided by Joseph's living siblings, who'd agreed to testing to help solve the mystery. The sibling matches were definitive. After 65 years, there was no doubt. The boy in the box was Joseph Augustus Zarelli. Within hours of the press conference, people began arriving at Joseph's grave at Ivy Hill Cemetery. The trickle became a flood. Hundreds of people came to pay their respects, now that they finally knew his name. Someone had placed a new bouquet of flowers on the grave, with a card that read simply, "Joseph. Finally, you have your name back. Rest in peace." The gravestone was old, weathered by 65 years of Philadelphia weather. It still read, "Heavenly Father, bless this unknown boy." But plans were already underway to replace it with a new stone bearing Joseph's real name. The Philadelphia community, which had adopted this murdered child so many years ago, now mourned him with new specificity. He wasn't just the boy anymore. He was Joseph. He'd had a name, a family, a life, however brief and tragic. News of the identification spread rapidly. National media picked up the story. The New York Times, The Washington Post, CNN, all ran features about the boy in the box finally being identified after 65 years. It became one of the most significant cold case breakthroughs of 2022. True crime communities on social media exploded with discussion about the case. Amateur sleuths who'd spent years researching the mystery tried to process the new information. Some had been close to the truth in their theories. Others had been completely wrong. But everyone was stunned that the case had finally been solved. The identification also sparked conversations about cold case investigations and the power of genetic genealogy. The Golden State Killer case in 2018 had demonstrated the technique's potential. Joseph's case proved it could work even on cases from the 1950s, even when the victims' remains had been buried for decades. Police departments across the country began reviewing their own unsolved cases, wondering if genetic genealogy might finally provide answers. How many other, unknown children, how many unidentified victims, might finally get their names back? For the detectives who'd worked the case over the years, the identification brought mixed emotions. Relief that the mystery was finally solved. Satisfaction that science had accomplished what traditional investigation couldn't. But also frustration that it had taken so long, and sadness that so many people who'd worked the case, including Detective Samuel Weinstein, hadn't lived to see this day. Weinstein's daughter was contacted by the police department and informed of the breakthrough. She was invited to the press conference but declined, saying it would be too emotional. Later, she released a statement, "My father never gave up on that little boy. He kept his promise, even though he didn't live to see it fulfilled. I know he's at peace now, knowing the boy finally has his name back." The investigation into exactly what happened to Joseph continued throughout 2023 and into 2024. Detectives interviewed surviving family members, reviewed old records, and tried to piece together Joseph's final days. What emerged was a picture of a deeply troubled family. Joseph's father had struggled with mental illness and alcohol abuse. His mother had been overwhelmed, trying to manage multiple children with limited resources and a volatile husband. Joseph had been singled out within the family, blamed for things, treated more harshly than his siblings. Whether this was due to developmental issues, behavioral problems, or simply cruel scapegoating, no one could say with certainty after all these years. In late 1956 or very early 1957, Joseph had been removed from the family home. Where he'd been taken, and by whom, remained unclear. Some family members suggested he might have been placed with a relative temporarily. Others thought his parents might have been trying to arrange an unofficial adoption or placement. What was clear was that during this time away from home, the abuse intensified. The systematic starvation, the brutal beatings, the ultimate murder, these occurred while Joseph was separated from most of his family. The investigation focused on trying to identify who had custody of Joseph during those final weeks of his life. Was it a relative? A family friend? Had his parents essentially sold or given him to someone? The answers remained elusive. Both of Joseph's parents were deceased, so they couldn't be prosecuted even if definitive evidence of their guilt emerged. But if other people had been involved, relatives, friends, accomplices, and if any of them were still alive, they could potentially face charges. As of early 2024, no arrests had been made in connection with Joseph's death. The investigation remained open and active, but police acknowledged the challenges of prosecuting a 67-year-old murder when most witnesses and suspects were dead. What the identification did accomplish was giving Joseph his dignity back. He was no longer just the boy in the box, a nameless victim defined only by the container he'd been discarded in. He was Joseph Augustus Zarelli, a child who'd lived, who'd had a family, who deserved to be remembered as a person. On June 17, 2023, a new gravestone was placed at Joseph's burial site. It read, Joseph Augustus Zarelli, January 13, 1953, February 1957, beloved child of God forever in our hearts. The dedication ceremony was attended by hundreds of people. Some were police officers and investigators who'd worked the case over the years. Some were genealogists and forensic specialists who'd helped identify him. But most were ordinary Philadelphia residents who'd followed the case for decades and wanted to honor Joseph's memory. A local priest conducted a brief service. He spoke about Joseph's suffering, about the city's long commitment to remembering him, and about the importance of finally knowing his name. For 65 years, this child was unknown to us, the priest said. But he was never unknown to God. God knew his name. And now, finally, we do too. Joseph Augustus Sorelli. May he rest in eternal peace. The Boy in the Box case stands as one of the longest-running murder investigations in American history. From February 1957 to December 2022, 65 years and 10 months, the boy remained unidentified despite massive efforts by law enforcement, enormous public interest, and the dedication of multiple generations of investigators. The case changed how law enforcement approaches unidentified victims. The massive publicity campaign in 1957, the extensive distribution of the boy's photograph, the coordination between multiple agencies, these became templates for handling similar cases in the future. The case also highlighted the vulnerabilities of children in mid-20th century America. Joseph's death occurred at a time when child abuse was less likely to be reported, when children had fewer legal protections, when troubled families could hide terrible secrets behind closed doors. If Joseph were alive today, the systems in place to protect children are significantly stronger. Mandatory reporting laws require teachers, doctors, and other professionals to report suspected abuse. Child protective services have more resources and authority to intervene. Public awareness of child abuse is dramatically higher. Would these systems have saved Joseph? It's impossible to say. But they've certainly saved other children who might otherwise have suffered similar fates. The case also demonstrated the power of community memory. For 65 years, the people of Philadelphia refused to forget the boy in the box. They visited his grave. They left flowers and toys. They kept his story alive through generations. That collective memory served a purpose. It kept pressure on law enforcement to continue investigating. It ensured that when new technologies became available, they were applied to the case. And it meant that when Joseph was finally identified, there was a community ready to honor his memory with his true name. The genetic genealogy breakthrough that identified Joseph has implications far beyond his individual case. The technique has now been used to solve dozens of cold cases across the country. Unidentified victims have been given their names back. Long-sought killers have been identified and arrested. The Golden State Killer case in 2018 proved the technique could identify perpetrators. Joseph's case in 2022 proved it could identify victims, even decades after their deaths. Together, these breakthroughs have revolutionized cold case investigation. Law enforcement agencies are now systematically reviewing unsolved cases, extracting DNA evidence, and submitting it for genetic genealogy analysis. Cases that were considered permanently unsolvable are being reopened. Families who'd given up hope are getting answers. But the technique also raises difficult questions about privacy and consent. The DNA profiles used in genetic genealogy come from people who voluntarily uploaded their information to public databases, often to learn about their ancestry or find distant relatives. They didn't necessarily consent to having their genetic information used in criminal investigations. These ethical questions continue to be debated. But for families of victims like Joseph, the benefits are clear. After 65 years of not knowing, they finally have answers. The technique gave Joseph his identity back and gave his family the truth about what happened to their brother. The Boy in the Box case has been featured in numerous books, documentaries, television programs, and podcasts over the decades. Each generation has rediscovered the mystery and been haunted by the image of that small boy in that cardboard box. Now those retellings can end with Joseph's name. The story is no longer just about an unsolved mystery. It's about Joseph Augustus Zarelli, a real child who lived and died and who is finally being remembered as he deserved to be all along. For the detectives who worked the case over the years, Joseph's identification brought a sense of completion, even for those who didn't live to see it. Detective Samuel Weinstein, who made that promise in 1957 to find out who the boy was, kept that promise even though he died before it could be fulfilled. Every detective who worked the case after Weinstein was honoring that same promise. They were refusing to let Joseph be forgotten. They were insisting that his life mattered, that his death demanded justice, that he deserved his name back. The investigation into who killed Joseph Augustus Zarelli continues. It may never result in an arrest or trial, given how much time has passed and how many key figures are deceased. But the search for truth continues nonetheless. Because Joseph deserves that. He deserves to have his complete story told, not just his identity but what happened to him and why. He deserves justice, even if that justice can only be historical truth rather than legal prosecution. The grave at Ivy Hill Cemetery remains a pilgrimage site. People still visit, still leave flowers, still remember. But now they remember Joseph by name. They remember a real child, not just a mystery. On the anniversary of his identification each December, the Philadelphia Police Department holds a memorial service at the grave. Officers who worked the case, genealogists who helped solve it, and community members who never forgot gather to honor Joseph's memory. The service is brief but meaningful. Joseph's name is read aloud. The story of his identification is retold, ensuring new generations understand the decades-long quest to give him his identity back. And flowers are laid on his grave, just as they have been for 65 years, but now with a name attached, Joseph. In 2023, the Philadelphia Police Department announced the creation of the Joseph Augustus Zarelli Cold Case Initiative, a program dedicated to using genetic genealogy to solve other long unsolved cases involving unidentified victims. The program is funded by grants and donations and staffed by detectives and genealogists committed to giving other victims their names back, just as Joseph finally received his. It's a fitting legacy. Joseph's death was a tragedy. The decades he spent unidentified were a failure of justice. But his eventual identification became a breakthrough that will help solve other cases, help other families find answers. Joseph Augustus Zarelli was 4 years old when he died. He lived a short, brutal life marked by abuse and ending in murder. For 65 years after his death, he existed only as a mystery, a photograph of a deceased child that haunted everyone who saw it. But now he's remembered as he should be. As Joseph. As a child who deserved better than what life gave him. As a person whose name and memory matter. The cardboard box is long gone. The blanket, the evidence, the crime scene photos exist only in archived files. But Joseph's grave remains, and his name is finally on the headstone. He will not be forgotten. Philadelphia claimed him as their own in 1957, when he was just the boy in the box. Now they honor him as Joseph Augustus Zarelli, a child of their city who deserved so much more than what he received. This is his story. The complete story, from his tragic death to his eventual identification 65 years later. A story of investigative persistence, technological breakthrough, and a community that refused to let a murdered child be forgotten. Joseph Augustus Zarelli. Say his name. Remember him. Because he matters. His life mattered. His death mattered. And his identity, finally restored, matters most of all. If you know anything about what happened to Joseph in February 1957, the Philadelphia Police Department urges you to come forward. Even now, even after all these years, the search for complete truth continues. Justice for Joseph is incomplete. But at least now, finally, he has his name back. Rest in peace, Joseph Augustus Zarelli. If this case affected you as much as it affected me, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. We're dedicated to telling these stories with the respect and detail they deserve, to making sure victims like Joseph are never forgotten. Leave a like to help more people discover this case. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and which cold case you'd like to see covered next. The fight for justice never ends, even 65 years later. Thank you for watching.